Hello everyone, how's it going? In this video, we will take a look at the default and name arguments in Kotlin. In most programming languages, we need to specify all the arguments that a function can take while calling that function. So as we saw in the previous video, we were unable to call a function without passing the required arguments. But in Kotlin, we need not specify all the arguments that a function accepts while calling that function. So this is a great feature of Kotlin, and we will dive into it in a moment. So in Kotlin, we can get rid of this constraint. So what constraint are we talking about? The constraint that we have is we need to supply all the arguments while calling a function. But in Kotlin, we have exception to this rule, and we can make parameters optional. That is, we pass an argument or not while calling a function. So first, let's talk about the two types of arguments in Kotlin. We have default arguments and we have named arguments. Let's talk about the default arguments first. Sometimes a function may want to treat some values of its parameters as optional and assume default values for them if a value is not supplied. So in this situation, default arguments come in handy. And by default arguments, we mean that default arguments are arguments which need not to be specified explicitly while calling a function. So now let's try to understand this with the help of a program. So I'm going to create a function and we are going to set the default values for the parameters. So I'm going to create a function and let's call this print name. And this function will have one parameter. It will take name as an argument and this will be of type string. So what this function will do, it will basically print hello and plus the name we supplied. And by this plus symbol, we are basically concatenating the two strings together. So now let's call this function. So I'm going to call it print name. And I'm going to supply a name. I'm going to type max. So let's run this program to see the output. So here we can see our program is up and running and we can see we have hello max printed in the output window. So we know that this argument is required. So what happens if we do not supply an argument? We will get an error saying that an argument is required for this function. So that means that we have to supply an argument. So how we can make this argument an optional? So that is where we are going to use the default arguments. To make this argument as optional, we are going to set the value for this argument inside the parentheses. So I'm going to set this equal to anonymous. So this means that when no arguments are passed while calling this function, the default arguments will be used and this is equal to anonymous right here. So now I'm going to run the program and we can see the output. So here we can see we have hello anonymous printed in the output window. So we can see that we are calling the print name function without supplying an argument. So that means the function will use the value of name parameter equal to anonymous. So these are the default arguments. If no arguments are supplied, the function will use this value for the name argument. So now the question is, what happens if we supply an argument here? For example, if we pass max while calling the print name function. So let's run the program to see the output. Our program is up and running and we can see that we have hello max printed in the output window. So that means that whenever we supply an argument here, so this argument will get precedence over the default argument. So if we supply an argument while calling the function, this argument will be used instead of the default one. One really important thing to note is that this default value can also be a function call. So instead of an anonymous writing here, I can get this value from a function. So let's call this function get name. And since that function is not defined, I'm going to create this. So fun get name. And this function will return anonymous. And we have to supply the return type, so this will be string. So since the values are evaluated at call time, we should make sure that this function call doesn't take too much time, otherwise it will affect the performance of our program. Now let's run the program to see the output. I have to remove this argument so that it will use the default argument. Let's run the program again. And here we can see we have hello anonymous printed in the output window. So what is happening is we are calling print name without supplying any arguments. So this function will use the default value, and this function will get the default value from this getName function. So it's going to call this function. This function is going to return anonymous, and that will be used as the value of the argument. All right, so let us now see another example of the default arguments. So I'm going to remove this, and I'm going to remove this function call. Let's define a function called print_info. And this will take two arguments, a name which will be of type string and age which will be of type int. So name will have a default value, let's say XYZ, and age will have a default value of 18. So what this function will do, it will just print ln my name is name. This will get the value from the name argument, and I am years old. So the age will get the value from this argument. So I'm going to call this function 3 different times, and with the first call I'm going to provide both the arguments. Name, let's say call it Max, and age, let's say 22. Oops, I should call print_info instead. And in the second function call, I'm going to call this function, and I'm going to pass only Max as the name, and I'm not going to pass anything for the age. In the third function call, I'm going to just call this function without passing any values for the arguments. And in the last function call, I'm going to call this function, and I'm going to pass the value of age, let's say 25. So let's comment this for now, and let's run the program, and we'll see the output. So our program is up and running, and we can see with the first function call we have supplied both the arguments, the name and age, and we get the output as my name is Max and I'm 22 years old. So none of the default values are used. In the second function call, we have supplied the value for the name, but age is using the default value of 18. And in the third function call, I'm not supplying any value for either name or age, and both of the default values are used in this case. So now I'm going to uncomment this function call, and I'm going to comment all these function calls. And here we can see that we have an error. We will explore what the error is and how we can overcome this error in the next video, where we talk about the named arguments.